Hey friends, welcome back to the Animal Nerd podcast. I am allegedly your host, and I am so happy that you're here. This is yet another one of those episodes where I'm just using the show as an excuse to fall back down a rabbit hole I first discovered as a child. Because yes, I did spend my entire childhood and teen years reading about animals. And now I'm in my 20s and I'm still doing it. Only now afterwards I record myself talking about it and pretend that makes it slightly less lame. Today we're talking about the golden tiger, also known as the golden tabby tiger and occasionally even the strawberry blonde tiger. And what is a golden tiger, you may ask? How is it any different from a regular tiger? Well, my darling, just listen a moment longer and I'll enlighten you. Golden tigers are possibly the rarest type of tiger in the world, but they're not actually their own species. Rather, they're a colour variation found only in Bengal tigers, and honestly, golden tigers are stunning. The mutation causes their stripes, rather than the harsh black of a typical tiger, to be this gorgeous coppery colour, sometimes described as being similar to strawberry blonde. That's the only real difference between a golden and an orange tiger, and you really wouldn't think having differently coloured stripes makes it that much of a difference. But it really does. The decreased contrast makes the stripes more subtle and overall makes them look a lot softer and more elegant. And although these tigers don't tend to have more white markings than orange tigers, the lighter stripes make it look as though they do. They really help highlight them. And while I don't think it does actually affect their base colour, something about the lighter stripes make them look a shade or two lighter overall. And sometimes golden tabby tigers will also have less striping than a typical tiger. I mean, they still have plenty of prominent stripes, and in some individuals the number and size of stripes are no different to any other tiger. But in some golden tigers, their stripes actually fade slightly as they go down the body, sometimes ghosting and sometimes forming spots or patches. I think they also tend to have slightly lighter eyes than an orange tiger. All in all, golden tabby tigers are utterly striking. I mean, all tigers are, of course, regardless of their colour, but the fact that goldens look different from any other tiger you'll probably have ever seen before really makes them stand out as something special. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. Because of their rarity and beauty, golden tigers have been deliberately bred by zoos and circuses to draw in larger crowds, as well as by private dealers in places where you're allowed to keep tigers as pets because they bring in a much higher price tag. These things are all whole ethical issues that we'll get into in a minute, but first I want to talk a bit more about the coloration itself. Now, I could go into super specific details on the science and genes behind the golden variation, but that would probably be boring and I am very much not an expert in animal colour genetics, so I'd probably end up getting something wrong anyway. One important thing to note is that the golden tabby colouring is the result of a recessive gene. This means that a tiger can carry the gene without expressing it. You could theoretically have two normal orange tigers who produce golden tabby cubs, though neither of them are themselves golden tabbies. The mutated gene that causes the coloration apparently also causes golden tigers to have shorter fur than typical, although you can't really tell just by looking, or at least looking from a distance, and I'm certainly not volunteering to get up close and personal with a tiger to try and verify that. They also apparently tend to be larger than other tigers too, so it would be even easier for them to kill you if you were to go and investigate their hair length. A much better known and more common tiger colour mutation is the white tiger, which is kind of the opposite of the golden variant, affecting the base colour but not the stripes. But even white tigers are exceptionally rare, with less than 1 in 10,000 cubs being born white. At least that's in the wild. Of course, it's much more common in captivity, where, again, it's been deliberately bred. There are over 200 white tigers in captivity around the world. Meanwhile, there hasn't been a documented example of a white tiger occurring in the wild since at least the 1950s. It was, of course, shot and killed on sight because humans. This all gives a pretty good idea of how rare white tigers are. But here's the thing, golden tigers are even rarer. 200 white tigers may not sound like a lot, but what if I told you that it's estimated that there are only about 30 golden tigers in the whole world? That's how rare these guys are. There's actually one tiger variant that I think is even rarer though, and that's known as the snow white tiger. This is basically the result of a tiger that expresses both the genes that cause white tigers and the gene that causes golden tabbies. So they have the white base, but they also have the lighter stripes of golden tabby, and like the golden tabby, some of those stripes will fade out into nothing. The result is that some of these tigers look pure white, earning the other nickname of the stripless tiger, although they're never truly stripeless. They have these almost ghost-like markings. In fact, in general, they just look like ghosts, like a tiger in spirit form. But beautiful though stripeless snow white tigers are, this episode isn't about them. Although I can do a full episode on them if you want, or maybe a mini-sode. Let me know if you'd be into that. But back to golden tabbies. Considering that there hasn't been a single white tiger born in the wild for about 70 years, and golden tigers are even rarer than them, you're probably expecting me to say that there haven't been any wild examples of them for even longer. And that's the fascinating thing. There are. Of the 30 or so golden tigers in the wild, 4 of those are wild. And this isn't a case of a captive bred tiger escaping or being released. These tigers are ones that have been born in the wild, to wild-born parents. And at first glance, that seems great, right? These beautiful animals are naturally occurring, meaning people can admire their rarity without having to support unethical captive breeding practices. They can see them in their natural environment, the most beautiful backdrop a tiger can have. Not to mention that it should also give the wildlife reserve where they live a nice boost of ecotourism from people desperate to catch a glimpse of them. Well, I suppose those things are all true, but that doesn't mean that a wild population of golden tigers is a good thing. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It's a pretty glaring red flag for conservationists that things are not going well for wild Bengal tigers. Let me explain. all 4 of the wild golden tigers are from the Kaziranga National Park, which is located in Assam in northeast India. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site with well over 400 square kilometres of stunning marshland, rivers and forests, and is home to a wide range of species, including, of course, Bengal tigers. While it doesn't have the largest population of tigers in the world, or even in India, it does have the highest tiger population density of any protected area in the world, and is home to 70% of all tigers in Assam. But that's not Kaziranga's biggest claim to fame. It's best known for its thriving population of Indian rhinos. It's actually home to about 1/3 of all the Indian rhinos on the planet. And that's on top of the countless other species that call this beautiful corner of the world their home. It's a true wildlife haven. But this still all sounds perfect. So what's the problem? Well, as I said, golden tigers are incredibly rare, to the point where wild, naturally occurring births of them are practically unheard of. And yet Kaziranga has 4. That's a massive indicator that their population of tigers are lacking genetic diversity, that they're all just inbreeding. In order for a golden tiger to, well, be a golden tiger, they need to inherit a copy of the relevant gene from both parents. And because that mutated gene is so rare, it doesn't really happen in the wild, especially as even if both parents have a copy of the gene, they can still produce normal orange cubs, although those cubs will also be carriers. Point is, it's borderline impossible for a pair of 2 totally unrelated tigers to produce a golden tabby cub. The likelihood of them both having the specific gene needed and the gene expressing itself in the offspring is infinitesimally small. I mean, look at it this way. The white gene is way more common than the golden one, but there hasn't been a single documented case of a wild white tiger being born for at least 70 years, maybe more. And theoretically, golden tigers should be even less common than that. So Kaziranga having 4 of these incredibly rare tigers is a clear anomaly. And the reason for this concentration of golden tigers is what's known as population fragmentation. In a nutshell, this refers to when a species' habitat is so destroyed by humans that it becomes almost like their own little islands. Typically, once they reach maturity, a tiger will leave the territory where they were born in to find their own, and their new territory will overlap with that of other unrelated tigers with whom they can safely breed. But when connecting habitat is destroyed so much that tigers can't leave the area they were born in, then they have no choice but to stay there and mate with whatever tigers they come across. And when this keeps happening, it's only a matter of time until every tiger being born in that area is related to every other tiger. As generations pass, the gene pool gets smaller and smaller, and they all become more and more related and inbred. So if even just 1 or 2 individuals have a rare genetic mutation like the golden tabby gene, if they become a victim of habitat fragmentation, then they'll end up breeding with closely related tigers, sometimes including their own parents or siblings, who may also have that gene, which is then passed down onto their cubs, who grow up and also end up mating with closely related tigers, including, again, their siblings who also inherited that gene from their parents, or the very parents who they inherited it from. Essentially, the population becomes so isolated that they all end up being related to some degree, which means they all share the same gene pool, and thus if a certain gene is present in that pool, it's going to be something they all end up with sooner or later. Hence why the presence of multiple wild golden tigers is so worrying. One could be written down as a fluke, a freak mating between compatible individuals, but multiple adults all showing the same mutation, that's a real cause for concern. The golden tabby coloration itself isn't known to have any links to any particular health problems. However, inbreeding obviously is very closely linked to a litany of medical conditions and birth defects, which absolutely can affect the survival rates of individuals and thus of an entire species. And that's why it's so worrying. Not to mention the fact that some animals, like people, will have genetic weaknesses to certain illnesses that others might be able to fight off. So again, when all the tigers in an area are closely related, and most or all of them share that particular weakness, well, that's just a disaster waiting to happen. And unless something is done to solve the problem of population isolation, then it's just going to get worse as every next generation of cubs are born more and more inbred than their parents. So what's the way forward? Well, there have been several possible solutions to population fragmentation put forward by conservationists over the years. These include relatively straightforward ones like creating forest corridors in between populations, which are exactly what they sound like, stretches of protected forest that are planted to link up isolated areas, which then allow tigers to migrate freely from one territory to another as they're supposed to. But there are other methods that could be used too, for routes where forest corridors aren't an option. These include specially designed tunnels and bridges to allow tigers to pass under or over things like busy roads that they wouldn't otherwise be able to traverse. While I've never heard of this being done with tigers, I know that in some cases where animal populations are really struggling with a restricted gene pool, conservationists will literally anaesthetize an animal and then just scoop them up and put them in a different area, one where they're not related to any of the other residents. It's drastic and pretty last resort, but desperate times call for desperate measures, and it brings about results quicker than it would take to build the kind of infrastructure required to link populations more organically. But obviously it's not a very long-term plan. Although population fragmentation and a lack of genetic diversity are absolutely issues that are threatening the survival of species like tigers, conservationists have pointed out that they're not the biggest threat to the survival of Bengal tigers. That dubious title goes to habitat destruction and, of course, poaching, which remains a massive and imminent risk to tigers among plenty of other species. Of course, experts across India and the world are working hard to combat all 3 of these dangers, to ensure that these beautiful creatures are protected and preserved for generations to come. And if ensuring a safe future for tigers means that we don't see any more golden tabbies, well, I don't think that's much of a loss. Yes, they're stunning, but if they can only exist under conditions that harm their species, then all we can do is hope that one day people will only know what they look like through looking at old photos. that they'll be consigned to the history books along with wild white tigers, while populations of healthy, genetically diverse orange tigers thrive. And speaking of photos of golden tigers, when I started researching for this episode, I was surprised to find that they've been making headlines recently. Like I said, when I first decided that I wanted to do an episode on golden tabbies, it was because I'd gone through a period of being really interested in them as a child. But back then they were something that existed only in captivity, where they'd been deliberately bred by unethical establishments who deliberately mated closely related tigers, despite the health problems that the inbreeding was causing, because it was the only way to reliably produce their coloration. This was one of the first major animal welfare issues that I ever learned about as a child, and it freaking infuriated me. I can understand why people would be willing to let animals suffer just because some people thought they looked prettier, especially as regular coloured tigers were already so beautiful. And honestly, my feelings on the matter haven't really changed since. I mean, I think it's at least slightly less common now. Most reputable zoos and collections nowadays focus on breeding healthy animals with a view to their use and conservation, rather than going for whatever will make them the most money, although that's not to say it's totally a thing of the past. Wherever there's money to be made, there'll always be awful people there trying to exploit it, no matter how unethical it may be. But my point is, I assume that's all there was out there about golden tigers, that they were a unique and beautiful colour variation that only existed in the confines of captivity. So I was shocked when I sat down to start researching for this episode, and some of the first stuff that came up were news articles from January this year talking about how someone had gotten a photo of a wild golden tiger that had subsequently gone viral online. Like, how did I not know about this at the time? So, of course, I did some digging and learned about the golden tigers of Kaziranga, who have apparently been known about since 2014 and subsequently fell down a rabbit hole, again. I'd assumed that this topic was going to have to be a mini-sode because there wouldn't be much more to say other than, this is a cool looking but problematic thing that exists and people shouldn't breed them. But it turned out to be this whole thing about habitat loss and isolated populations and decreased genetic diversity, and before I knew it, the script had spiraled into something that was way too long to be a mini-sode. This makes it sound like I'm wrapping up and going to the outro. I'm not, there's more, don't switch off yet. Are you still there? Good. I absolutely could not make this episode without talking about the guy who brought the issue of wild golden tigers to the public's attention with that aforementioned photo. His name is Gaurav Ramnarayanan, and as well as being an award-winning photographer, he also runs his own travel company called the Wildside. They offer holidays, photography tours, private safaris, all kinds of cool and probably expensive stuff. Of course, I'll have a link to their website in the show notes, just on the off chance anyone listening to this is considering a wildlife holiday to India anytime soon. Or to anywhere else for that matter. They also operate across Africa, Europe and South America. This sounds like I'm doing an ad for them or something. I'm not. I wish someone would pay me to podcast. But you guys know how I feel by now about supporting those who are out there trying to make the world a better place, and ecotourism is a really powerful way of funding conservation work and the fight against climate change, so I thought it would be worth mentioning. And it is kind of relevant because it was while he was leading one of his private safaris in Kaziranga National Park that Gaurav came across a golden tiger for the first time in his life. In all his years of giving wildlife tours, he'd never seen one before. And this wasn't a case of glimpsing a half-hidden figure through the undergrowth. This tiger was just strolling along the road marking his territory, not remotely bothered about the jeep of tourists that had just stopped to let him past. He came within 100 metres of them. I can't imagine how incredible it must be to have that kind of encounter with a tiger, let alone one this rare and unique. Gaurav managed to get some absolutely stunning photos of this tiger, which he of course shared online. The pictures went viral because, I mean, gorgeous animal, gorgeous photo, super rare sight, people were fascinated. I came across some more of Gaurav's photos while browsing the Wildside website, and honestly, they are stunning. Genuinely some of the best wildlife photography I think I've ever seen. I would highly recommend checking them out if that's your kind of thing. And although Gaurav's photo is probably the best known sighting of a wild golden tiger, it wasn't the first of its kind to go viral. Back in 2020, photos by photographer and filmmaker Mayuresh Hendry also attracted a fair bit of attention. And again, his photos are absolutely stunning, as is all of his work. He sells prints via his website, including the one of the golden tiger, which I will of course have linked in the show notes if you want to check out his stuff or buy yourself one to brighten up your space. I have to say I'm very tempted. He also has a YouTube channel called Way to the Wild, where he shares some of his filmmaking work, and again, absolutely incredible stuff. I would highly recommend checking it out. His stuff is all absolutely gorgeous, and he even has a video about his experience with the golden tiger he photographed, who he's seen several times and has named Goldie. Both Gaurav and Mayuresh have said that they hope the attention their photos received would spark more awareness of the dangers facing Bengal tigers, including population fragmentation, and that more awareness would lead to more action to save them. And I know it sounds pretentious and self-aggrandizing, but honestly that's also kind of the hope I have for this podcast. That's why I keep making episodes about wild animals, even though they never perform as well as my episodes about domestic ones. I mean, I know my current numbers in general are not great, this is obviously a podcast that is far from popular, but often all it takes is to spark interest or passion in just one person to create a domino effect that has more of an impact than you could ever imagine. Or at least that's what I'm hoping. I mean, this whole show is a non-profit venture. Any money I ever make from it will go straight to animal rescue. All I want to do in my little corner of the internet is help animals in whatever way I can. And hopefully also help some people along the way too, even if it's just in the form of giving them something vaguely interesting or entertaining to listen to. And who knows, maybe one day my podcast will actually do well and bring in decent numbers. Maybe. Hopefully. I can dream. I didn't really intend to go off on a tangent about myself there, that wasn't really planned. I'm sorry. But yeah, that's the deal with golden tabby tigers. They might be beautiful, but that doesn't mean that their presence is a good thing. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd podcast. If you enjoyed it, then I would really appreciate it if you could support the show in any way you can. It really does help. Again, I'll have links to both the Wildside and my Irish Hendry's websites in the show notes if you want to check them out. I would highly recommend it. And of course, the sources used in this episode will also be down there for you to check out. New episodes of the Animal Nerd podcast come out every single Tuesday, as well as bonus minisodes every single whenever. And yeah, thank you again for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Stay wild, friends.